So imagine for a second that a massive, catastrophic storm is rolling in,
Okay.
and you decide to just spend an absolute fortune fortifying your apartment. I mean, you board up the windows with top-grade steel, you stock the pantry with like a year's supply of food, you install this state-of-the-art backup generator.
Right. Doing everything you possibly can.
Exactly. And you sit down on your couch, you listen to the wind howling outside, and you feel totally secure. But then, you realize something pretty terrifying.
Which is.
What happens if the building's shared foundation is crumbling? Or, what happens if the roof over your upstairs neighbor's apartment suddenly just caves in?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter how strong your own steel windows are at that point.
Right.
If the structural integrity of the entire building fails, well, the water is still coming right into your living room.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We have an incredibly compelling stack of research to get through today. We're looking at recent policy commentaries, some really fascinating academic drafts, and detailed references from the IPCC.
Which, for those who might not know, is essentially the United Nations' supreme authority on climate science.
Exactly. And our mission today is to unpack this massive systemic blind spot in how the entire world is preparing for climate change.
It's a big one.
It really is. The core premise we are looking at is that we are collectively suffering from what the sources call a fortress illusion. Basically, we are trying to manage a completely borderless planetary crisis using strictly national tools.
Which creates a fundamental mismatch. I mean, we are actively building these incredibly robust national fortresses, pouring billions of dollars into domestic resilience, but we're completely ignoring the reality that climate risk travels.
Yeah, it doesn't just stay put.
No, it cascades through these interdependent systems, and national borders mean absolutely nothing to those cascades.
So to see how this actually plays out practically, we really have to look at national adaptation plans, or NAPs. Over the past decade, spurred on by the Paris Agreement, over 70 countries have produced these highly detailed plans. And on paper, especially when you look at the global north, it looks like incredible progress.
Oh, absolutely.
Countries are mapping out their floodplains, they're engineering new drought-resistant crops, and they're building these massive coastal storm defenses. But wait, okay, let's unpack this for a second because I need pushback on this before we go further.
Sure, go ahead.
If Germany or the United States or Japan spends billions to build massive flood walls for their own coastal cities, their people are protected. How is that a bad thing? I mean, isn't securing your own backyard step one? Why do the sources call this current setup a dangerous paradox?
Well, securing your own backyard totally makes sense intuitively.
Right.
But the paradox arises because of something called transboundary climate risks, or TCRs.
Okay.
These are the climate impacts that literally cross borders. So the danger isn't the act of self-protection itself. The danger is the structural under-integration of the wider picture.
What do you mean by under-integration?
So the research highlights this review of 41 multi-sector NFPs submitted to the UN, and it showed that these national plans only sporadically even mention transboundary issues.
Wow, out of 41.
Yeah, and the reason really comes down to the mechanics of institutional design. Budgets, political mandates, accountability, they're all strictly tied to the nation-state.
That makes sense. I mean, a politician is elected to protect their own voting district, right?
Yeah.
Not the agricultural basin in the country next door.
Exactly. So they optimize for the short-term domestic win. They want to cut the ribbon on a new seawall before the next election cycle.
Yeah, that classic political timeline.
Right. And that leads to a phenomenon known as maladaptation.
Maladaptation?
Yeah, this is where an adaptation measure in one country actively exports vulnerability to another. It physically degrades the shared system.
Okay, can you give an example of that?
Sure, let's look at the mechanics of those coastal surge barriers you just mentioned. If you build massive concrete barriers to protect your own shoreline, you are fundamentally altering the natural ocean currents and sediment flows.
Oh, I see.
And that altered flow can easily accelerate erosion on a neighboring country's coastline just a few miles away.
Wow.
Or if a nation adapts to a severe drought by implementing highly water-intensive irrigation from a shared river.
They're just taking more water.
Exactly. They are literally draining the water table and leaving the countries downstream completely dry. The current institutional architecture actively incentivizes countries to optimize for themselves at the direct expense of their neighbors.
That is wild. And, we've talked about human-made borders and territorial disputes, but there is a layer of infrastructure that crosses those borders every single second.
Oh, absolutely.
Before we even look at shared ecosystems, we have to look at the supply chains. The human-made networks that deliver our groceries, our consumer electronics, our medicines. Global trade networks are the first invisible border that climate change crosses.
Because global trade is the exact mechanism that turns a localized weather event into a planetary economic crisis.
Yes.
The Panama Canal drought from late 2023 into 2024 is just a perfect illustration of how this works physically.
Yeah, the sources went deep into this.
Right, because the canal doesn't just operate on ocean water. It relies heavily on fresh water from inland lakes to operate its lock system.
Which I didn't actually realize until reading this.
Yeah, a lot of people don't. Every time a ship passes through, those locks dump millions of gallons of fresh water into the ocean. And that water has to be replenished by rainfall.
And because of a combination of El Nino and climate-driven drought, the rain just simply stopped.
Precisely. The inland lakes dropped to critical levels. There physically wasn't enough water to operate the locks at normal capacity.
So they had to cut back.
Yeah, it forced the Canal Authority to slash vessel transits by over 30%.
Over 30%. And looking at the data, the Panama Canal handles about 5% of all global maritime trade.
Right.
And a staggering 40% of U.S. container traffic.
It's massive.
So a lack of rainfall over a few specific lakes in Central America instantly caused global economic friction.
Instantly.
Ships had to reroute completely around the tip of South America, which delayed goods, spiked shipping costs, and disrupted supply chains for energy and consumer goods across both the global north and south.
It really proves the whole concept of domestic resilience is incomplete. But there is a hidden layer to this that completely flips how we view national security,
Okay.
and that's imported climate risk.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Imported risk. Meaning, even if a wealthy, developed nation perfectly engineers its own domestic infrastructure and its farms to withstand extreme weather, it is still wildly vulnerable.
Why?
Because it relies on trade partners who haven't done the same.
Exactly. I mean, the global food system runs almost entirely on imported risk.
Yeah.
Take the 2010 Russian heat wave. The extreme temperatures physically stunted the wheat crop, slashing yields by a third.
A third of the crop just gone.
Gone. And in response to that local failure, the Russian government panicked about their own domestic food security and instituted a sudden export ban.
And here is where the mechanics of the global market just take over. When a major exporter suddenly pulls their supply, futures markets absolutely panic.
Yeah, that one export ban triggered massive global price spikes. Import-dependent nations, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, suddenly couldn't afford staple grains.
Which has massive ripple effects.
Enormous ones. It placed huge strain on government-bread subsidies and contributed to severe social unrest. And we saw the exact same compound mechanism play out again in 2022.
Right, during the massive heat wave in India and Pakistan, an event that climate models showed was made 30 times more likely by global warming.
30 times.
Yeah, and it devastated their domestic wheat yields.
And just like Russia, the Indian government abruptly banned wheat exports to secure their own supply.
But the timing there was critical.
Exactly, because this happened right alongside the outbreak of conflict in Ukraine, which had already removed a massive portion of the world's grain from the market.
So global wheat prices skyrocketed.
It threatened food security across the developing world, and it drove up food inflation right in the grocery aisles of the wealthiest nations on Earth.
Wow.
High-income nations routinely externalize their climate risk by relying on cheap global production networks.
The illusion of national resilience completely shatters when you realize your critical inputs are heavily concentrated in highly climate-exposed locations.
Right.
Like the 2011 Thailand floods really cement this idea. It wasn't just agriculture. It was high-tech manufacturing.
Yeah, those floods caused an estimated $46.5 billion in damages.
That is astronomical.
It is, and about 70% of that financial hit fell directly on the manufacturing sector.
Because the global economy operates on this just-in-time manufacturing model, right? Which is incredibly efficient, but wildly fragile.
Highly fragile. Because specific components for hard drives and automobiles were manufactured almost exclusively in flooded Thai industrial parks, assembly lines in Detroit and Tokyo literally ground to a halt.
They couldn't finish building cars because a river flooded halfway across the world.
Exactly. You cannot claim your nation is resilient if the systems you depend on are fragile somewhere else.
Okay, so human supply chains are completely exposed. But human supply chains are ultimately subservient to natural supply chains.
That's a good way to put it.
Nature has its own cross-border infrastructure that was moving resources millions of years before we invented cargo ships or drew lines on a map.
Right.
So when we shift from global shipping to shared ecosystems, the data points to massive, slow-moving crises in the world's shared river basins.
And the Mekong River Basin is perhaps the most urgent example of this.
Yeah, the sources spent a lot of time on the Mekong.
Because it flows through six sovereign nations: China, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and it directly sustains over 60 million people.
60 million.
Yeah, and climate change is already altering the monsoon cycles and melting the upstream glaciers that feed the river.
Right.
But compounding that natural disruption is completely uncoordinated human adaptation.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of that. Upstream countries are building massive hydropower dams, right?
Yeah.
As part of their national energy and economic strategies.
Yes, and those dams don't just hold back water. They trap millions of tons of vital sediment.
Which sounds bad for the areas further down.
And the downstream consequence in places like Vietnam is devastating. During extreme droughts, because the river's outward water pressure is so severely weakened by the upstream dams, it can no longer push back against the ocean.
Oh, wow.
So salt water from the sea is now intruding more than 90 kilometers inland into Vietnam's Mekong Delta.
90 kilometers.
Yeah. It is physically poisoning the soil and destroying their agricultural land.
You know, it's honestly like 6 people drinking from the same giant milkshake with 6 different straws.
Okay, I like this.
But they aren't talking to each other. And the person at the top is just pinching the straw of the person at the bottom, so the glasses at the bottom are just left completely bone dry.
That is a much more accurate way to visualize it, honestly. It is a tragedy of the commons playing out in slow motion.
Yeah.
Each country is optimizing its own national plan, filling its own glass, so to speak, but the shared structural basin degrades, and the existing water governance systems are simply ill-prepared to handle it.
And the geopolitical stakes get even higher when you look at the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, what researchers in the sources refer to as the third pole.
The scale of the Hindu Kush is almost hard to comprehend.
Yeah.
That region contains the largest volume of ice anywhere outside the polar regions, and its glacial melt feeds 10 major Asian river systems.
That's huge.
The rapid melting we are seeing there directly threatens the water security of nearly 2 billion people.
2 billion.
But the real danger is the geopolitical reality. These rivers cross into nations with deeply entrenched historical tensions, specifically India, Pakistan, and China.
All of which are nuclear-armed nations. And we need to be clear, the sources are completely neutral here. They aren't taking political sides. They're just pointing out the raw geopolitical facts.
Exactly. The fact is, in regions with existing border disputes, uncoordinated adaptation becomes a massive geopolitical security threat.
Right.
If one country hoards water in a new reservoir during a drought, or suddenly opens a dam during a flood without warning downstream neighbors, it isn't just an environmental management issue anymore.
No.
It can instantly turn a hydrological shock into a regional military conflict.
But the research makes it really clear this isn't just a dynamic in the global south either. Look at the Rhine River in Europe back in 2018.
Oh, yeah. A severe low-water episode on the Rhine impaired river transport for months.
And to understand the mechanism here, inland shipping relies on a certain water depth.
Right.
When the water drops too low, massive barges can only load maybe 20 or 30% of their normal cargo capacity just to avoid scraping the bottom.
And that multiplies transport costs exponentially. It causes massive shortages of fuels and raw materials far inland.
Like chemical plants in Germany had to scale back production simply because they couldn't get materials delivered.
Exactly. Even in wealthy Europe, a localized drop in water levels instantly became a multi-country logistics crisis.
Right.
Now, there are partial models for how to handle this. The Mekong River Commission actually developed a framework called MASS-AP, which outlines the need for transboundary cooperation.
Oh, okay. So there's some progress.
Some, but adoption has been incredibly slow. Governments are still defaulting to domestic disaster response.
Right. So when the trade networks fail, and when the shared rivers dry up or flood, the ultimate transboundary effect is human mobility.
Yes.
If the resources can't cross borders to sustain the people are going to cross borders to find the resources.
That is the inescapable conclusion of degraded environments. When livelihoods are physically destroyed, people have to move to survive. The World Bank Groundswell report projects that under pessimistic climate scenarios, we could see up to 216 million internal climate migrants by 2050.
216 million. And the projections for Bangladesh alone are just staggering.
They really are.
The World Bank expects up to 19.9 million internal migrants there. But the International Organization for Migration goes even further. They estimate that up to 40 million Bangladeshis could ultimately be displaced by sea level rise.
It's hard to even picture that many people.
To put that 40 million number into perspective, that is the equivalent of the entire population of California suddenly needing to pack up their homes, abandon their cities, and find somewhere else to live.
Wow.
That isn't just a localized tragedy, it's a structural earthquake for the entire global economy.
And we see the mechanics of this mobility very clearly in the Sahel region of West Africa.
Right.
Climate change is accelerating desertification there. Increasing droughts and declining river levels are destroying rain-fed agriculture.
So what happens then?
Well, when the farms fail, pastoralists who rely on grazing lands are forced to move their herds into areas traditionally held by farmers.
Which creates tension.
It leads to intense local conflict over dwindling resources. That drives rural communities into overcrowded urban centers and ultimately pushes cross-border movement into regions like Europe.
But here's the policy gap that absolutely blew my mind when I was reading through the stack. A review of 49 national adaptation plans submitted by late 2023 found that only 16 of them have any concrete policies on climate displacement.
Only 16?
Yeah. Pakistan experienced over 1 million internally displaced persons in 2022 alone due to massive flooding.
Right.
And yet their national adaptation plan has zero concrete policies for managing that mobility.
And this lack of planning dictates how destination regions respond.
How so?
Well, when faced with migration from places like the Sahel, destination regions, and again, the sources just impartially report this, such as the European Union, often frame this complex mobility strictly through the lens of border security.
Oh, I see.
They prioritize bilateral agreements and physical enforcement to curb migration, rather than treating it as a shared adaptation challenge that requires joint planning and massive investment in the agricultural resilience of the countries of origin.
They're trying to build a higher wall instead of helping to put out the fire next door.
Precisely. And failing to manage this slow-moving, shared vulnerability leads to policies that are highly reactive and ultimately ineffective.
Yeah.
If you don't plan for human mobility as a transboundary adaptation issue, you are simply waiting for a humanitarian crisis to overwhelm your border infrastructure.
Wow. So we've mapped out the broken architecture. We see the territorial trap we're stuck in with these national silos.
Right.
So what does this all mean? How do we actually rebuild it? Because the research doesn't just point out the problems, right? It lays out a very specific blueprint for a borderless future.
It does, and it starts with fundamental institutional innovation.
Okay.
The primary recommendation is that national adaptation plans must evolve into transboundary adaptation plans.
Making it international by default?
Exactly. Governments need to mandate cross-border risk assessments. Think of it like a developer having to do an environmental impact study before building a massive factory.
Right.
A country should have to analyze and disclose exactly how its domestic climate strategies will impact the water security of its neighbors and the supply chains of its trade partners.
That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
And the blueprint also leans heavily on establishing regional compacts.
Yes.
Instead of just national silos, creating synchronized early warning networks. But the really fascinating mechanism here is the idea of harmonized agricultural insurance pools.
Oh, that part is so important.
Let's actually look at how that works.
It's a brilliant mechanism for regional stability. Right now, if a drought hits a single country, their domestic insurance market collapses because everyone needs a payout at the exact same time.
Which bankrupts the system.
Exactly. But if you pool risk across borders, say across the entire Horn of Africa, the premiums collected from countries experiencing good rainfall that year can be used to cover the payouts for the countries experiencing drought.
Oh, wow.
It stabilizes the entire region's food supply and prevents the kind of economic collapse that drives mass migration.
But to make that happen, the entire structure of climate finance has to evolve.
Yes, it does.
Because right now, international bodies like the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund overwhelmingly support projects bounded by national borders.
Right. They fund single nations.
Yeah. The proposed reform in the sources is to reserve at least 20% of all adaptation finance strictly for multi-country transboundary initiatives.
Because by tying the funding to cooperation, you fundamentally change the incentives.
You force them to work together.
You force nations to apply together, We have to start funding the connective tissue between nations, not just the individual organs.
I love that analogy. And the
Yeah.
scientific community has to change how it measures success too, right?
Absolutely. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change acknowledged in their sixth assessment report that transboundary risks exist, but they didn't provide any framework for evaluating them. So, for the upcoming seventh assessment report, the scientific consensus is pushing the IPCC to mandate a cross-cutting synthesis of these risks.
To actually measure them.
Yes, we need standardized metrics to mathematically measure imported climate risk, because until policymakers actually have the hard data showing the hidden vulnerabilities in their supply chains, they just won't dedicate the budget to fix them.
To me, this fundamentally reframes the entire global paradigm.
How so?
Well, investing in climate adaptation in the global south is not some act of international charity or goodwill.
No, not at all.
It is a vital, non-negotiable matter of massive economic and national security for the global north.
Yeah, exactly.
If you want your supermarket shelves stocked and your auto plants running and your borders stable, you have to ensure your partners across the globe are just as resilient as you are.
That is the defining takeaway from all of this research. Adaptation is no longer a national project. It is a networked imperative.
A networked imperative.
Resilience is partly domestic, sure, but it is never only domestic. A global regime built entirely on nationally bounded strategies will fail to address the risks that actually matter most.
Right.
The cascading systemic failures that no single country can manage alone.
Climate change doesn't carry a passport. It doesn't stop at customs. And our solutions just can't either.
Very true.
So the next time you see a headline about a local flood halfway across the world, or a drought temporarily closing a major transit canal, or even just a sudden unexplained spike in your grocery bill, look for those hidden transboundary threads connecting it all.
And, it leaves us with something pretty profound to consider as we look to the next decade. If our basic survival, our food systems, our manufacturing economies, our geopolitical stability, if all of that now depends entirely on the resilience of our neighbors and global trade partners, will the climate crisis eventually force us to redefine what national sovereignty even means?
That is a huge thought to end on, because if you want to keep your own apartment dry, you better be sure the whole building's roof is sound. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.